Hey everybody, I'm going to talk to you for a little bit about Rick Beck. So Beck was born in Germany in 1944, and that was under Nazi rule during World War II. So his family fled due to political unrest, and he attended college at the University of Freiburg, but later had to restart because there's just too much turmoil with the war. And so after that, he went to the University of Munich and stayed there until he earned his doctorate in sociology in 1972. And so him and Hochschild are among our first sociologist theorists who kind of did what we would consider a traditional academic path, where you start and then, kind of go on until you finish. And so he stayed there for quite some time, was intentionally interdisciplinary, particularly because he became an early advocate for sociologists to study climate change and academics in general, thinking about like climate change being the defining issue of our time. And so he, was interested in that. He also was particularly interested in German sociology. So Weber was a big influence on him, but also Anthony Giddens, who is a UK sociologist, and Jürgen Habermas. And both of them are kind of big deal social theorists that, like, if we had more time, we would certainly discuss. And so if you're interested in social theory, I suggest trying to find out, particularly Habermas. Well, I don't know, actually both are pretty influential. Giddens, to the extent that you're more globally oriented, would be more interesting to you. And Habermas, if you're more interested in kind of like critical mindset type stuff. And so in terms of what we have read, Beck becomes really interested in Weber's idea of the iron cage because he thinks that bureaucracies are inherently dehumanizing. And he, kind of believed that there was this kind of pursuit of meaningless consumption in modern life, much like Weber did, because of this dehumanization within bureaucracies. And so he thought that modern life was really empty. And so, for that reason, then, he believed that, following in Habermas's kind of footsteps, that we are conforming to rationality, to bureaucracy, to no end, really. And so this made Beck adopt Habermas's idea of a negative utopia. So he would see kind of postmodern life. So what happened after industrialization, right? So this idea of postmodernism is that what are the big organizing thoughts after modernization or industrialization. And so for Habermas, for Beck, but also for Habermas, they believe that we have kind of approached this idea of a negative utopia. So we're moving forward, but for no real reason, with no real purpose, right? We're just kind of like on the march. And so he had this idea, Beck, of what he called second modernity. And second modernity is a modern society that has become rationalized under industrialism, but then dissolves itself as it tries to transform, legitimate, and confront issues, given that it doesn't have something that is pursuing towards, right? And so, again, with this idea of a negative utopia, there is no vision, right? It's not like Marxism, where at the end there is, kind of shared governance and shared society, freedom of kind of want. It isn't Durkheimian in the sense of once we have arrived, we have solidarity and community and understanding, right? We have something, but it's consumption. I don't, like advanced stage capitalism, right? And so because of that, then, we're kind of moving towards this model that doesn't really materialize anything. And this causes individuals to have what Habermas calls a reflective project. And so Beck, again, like really emphasizing Habermas's ideas, talks about a reflective reflective projects being ones where people try to internalize and make sense of their life theirself. And so life may be individual to that extent. As technology advances, as progress goes, you try to find trying to make decisions about yourself and about how you live. And this also then, because people like have to find this journey of themselves, by themselves, for themselves, right, without any kind of vision or destiny, that this fractures institutions, because we can no longer find ourselves in a church, in a negative utopia, or in school, or in work, because all of them are just pursuing growth to no end, and there's no source of meaning there, right? And so, okay, well, you can go to church, but your church is just trying to grow, and so they're not really going to help you find spiritual enlightenment. Or like you can work, but your workplace is just trying to make money, and they're not invested in their workers. In fact, they're trying to make money at the expense of their workers, and so like there's no hope there either. And so, like all of what we've privatized everything, blah blah blah, like all of the problems of modern capitalism. And so that leaves people nothing to do, to have a sense of self except for to turn inward, right? So we have to create our own sense of selves. Beck also, a couple more concepts that I want to talk about before I get to our reading. He really wants to emphasize the idea of risk versus catastrophe. So catastrophes are real things, like floods that are destroying northern Washington right now, right, like Northwest Washington. Those floods are tangible human disasters that are present, that we can see, and that we can understand. Risks, on the other hand, are problems that don't tangibly exist yet, but still preoccupy us because of the damage that they could create. And so, for instance, like modern risk is created and kind of amplified. So it's cyclical, right? It both creates and is created by things like overproduction, over modernization, having too much knowledge. So we might have heard this idea of being overemployed, right? So if most of you are overemployed at this sense, right, where you have jobs, you have a high level of education. That high level of education is not necessarily important to your job, right? It helps your job, but it doesn't necessarily help you, right? And so you might be overemployed in the sense that like you are better than your job, right? And so this kind of gives us this kind of break, right, from what might be reality, because we kind of live in this panic of what might be. So, like with COVID, we don't really know what's going to happen. We have more idea than we did last March, for sure, right? We really don't know what a post-COVID world is, but we're very much molding around it and like trying to deal with the risk of living in a post-COVID society. The same with like things like terrorism or climate change. Like we have some idea of some of the tangible problems that are associated or will be caused by these things, but we don't entirely know, right? And so we just have this kind of looming threat of, and we have to craft our reality based on what we think or what we perceive the risk will be. And so a risk society, and this is Beck's big theoretical contribution to sociology. The risk society is basically a place where we can no longer control our risks because we only can have, because again, risks are unknown. So all we can have is what he calls manufactured uncertainty. And so we can't get to certainty. We don't know what climate is going to make our lives like in 50 years, but we do know that we can expect disruption. And so we can manufacture some sense of what life might be with a 2 degree a year rise or 2 degree decade rise. So from back today, the central problem is no longer the distribution of wealth, but rather the prevention, minimization, and distribution of risks inherent in production process, so that neither hamper the modernization process nor exceed the limits of that which is tolerable ecologically, medically, psychologically, and socially, right? And so the risk society then is about like, so there will be modernization, there will be growth in some way, even though a lot of postmodernists argue about like what growth is necessary, how much growth is necessary, et cetera, right? But there will be that. And we have to decide what is tolerable for the world, for people, for, you know, I mean, like one of the things that we're trying to deal with now with COVID, right? Like we want to be able to see our families for the holidays. Most people do. We want to be able to travel. We want to be able to kind of resume life as normal. And so we have to figure out, because we can't ever really know what the risk is for doing those things, we have to take on some calculated insecurity, right? So, well, okay, I guess we are going to have, you know, in-person classes. We're going to try to run campus as normal. So we can guess that 5 people a month test positive for COVID. I don't even know what the numbers are, but I guarantee there's somebody in administration whose job is that right now, right? And to figure out like what is tolerable, you know, and try to figure out like when we're going to. I guarantee there's a number of cases somewhere that if we go past that, then we're back online, right? There certainly is for this for the city of Tacoma. There certainly is for Pierce County, right? And so, you know, with new infection rates or whatever, right, like we have to be watching because we have set this limit of what is not okay, okay? And why is it not okay? Well, we don't really know why, but like that's the level, right? You know, and obviously we like do kind of have some sense of why it's not okay. So maybe it's the hospitals are overran, that people can't get the medical attention that they need, that there's, you know, too much transmission, right? And so that's not to say that like in a risk society that we can't have metrics of what risk is or what could go bad, right? But we just really can't know. And so we have to just kind of be in Beck calls it like basically like our culture is one of unawareness and non-knowledge. So we have lots of information, we have lots of expertise, right? In fact, there can only be expertise in a risk society. But, you know, it's the same way when you listen to any of like our academic people talk about any of these issues that are facing us. You know, well, what happens here? What happens here? Well, we can't really know, right? We can't really know, but we can guess, or we can think it's associated with, because we can't know, right? Like, I think that growing economic inequality is really bad, and we're seeing lots of fallout from growing economic inequality. But like, can I know what like the real risk of it is? Not really, right? And not with certainty. So like, do I think more people will become unhomed? Yes. Do I think that more people will, you know, have food insecurity? Less people will go to college? Yes, yes, all those things, right? But, you know, like, what is the true risk? It's hard to say, right? And so, like, a lot of people want to think, like, oh, so this is bad, right? Like, negative utopia, this is about as bad as it gets. So, like, we're totally effed, right? And Beck's like, no, right? No. And in fact, he tries, very similar to Marx, tries to be a very intentionally optimistic theorist. So he says, first, we have to develop what he calls a risk of consciousness. So we have to decide how much risk we can tolerate and what kind of risk we can tolerate. And we have to pressure knowledge bases, people who control knowledge, to create both a social consciousness and, you know, this kind of like agreement that there are points where we will not go past, right? And so, for instance, as I was just talking about with COVID, like we have a number of new cases, we have a rate of growth that we're going to tolerate to there, and then we're going to come back, right? We're going to come back and do a lot more, you know, like being inside, being virtual, that kind of stuff, right? And so that's this idea that like together socially, we have a social conscious and we come together to identify what our risk consciousness is. We also have to not be what he calls a methodological nationalist. So we cannot think of our problems as in terms of what it means for the United States, what it means for Tacoma, what it means for Pierce County, like no small scale stuff. We have to think nationally because when we think about today's central problems, economic instability, ecological threats, terrorism, right? Those are all global problems. And so we can't be like, okay, well, how could we address this in the United States, right? Like, it doesn't matter at all, like what we do to address, I mean, it does matter to some extent what we do to address COVID in the United States, but it's a global pandemic, right? And so everything that we do only gets us so far, right? And so we can close the borders. What does that do? It might slow transmission, but like, did we keep out Delta? No, right? Like we didn't, right? You know, and I don't think any health expert ever thought we would. And so this idea that like, well, we're just going to think about what's good for the United States, like that's not going to help, right? At least it's not going to solve the problem. So we need to be methodologically nationalist. Beck also urges us to produce or to develop what he calls a methodological cosmopolitanism, to not be self-interested, right? So to not think about the problems as like, how is this going to affect me? How is this going to affect my country or my area, my region, right? But like instead, we're members of the global community and we're all in this together, right? These problems are really big. We need each other. And so we have to be working together to solve them. We have to be collective and we have to be, you know, kind of in this pursuit together. Okay, so where do we see this specifically in Climate for Change or How to Create Green Modernity? So he gives us 8 theses in this reading to determine how to evaluate these risks that he believes that we exist. And so, you know, he says, hey, like we got to be dealing with this, right? We got to be dealing with this because like we're at the brink of ecological disaster. And he says, but we don't feel that way, right? He wants to know, why don't we worry about it? Why don't we write about it, think about it in the same way that we do poverty, tyranny, war, all these other big problems? He starts on page 824. We don't have that kind of same kind of ideological change, like orientation, I suppose I'll say, towards climate. So why, right? So his first thesis is that climate discourse is expert and elitist discourse, neglecting the voices of the people. To the extent that we've talked about it, it has been economic, and it will cost to make changes now, but he's going to argue that it'll cost more later, right? And so effectively, like the conversations, to the extent that they're happening, are happening with experts only. And whenever we try to open it up to the lay people, right, or to the everyday person, the idea is that like, oh, we just talk about how expensive it's going to be, right? So you're like, yes, we could go carbon neutral, but like that's going to be so expensive. Or everyone could drive electric cars, but how is everyone going to afford a new car if everybody has to drive an electric car, right? And so, you know, this makes people then feel doomed, is his word on page 825, column 1. So we've basically like, you know, kind of we've also framed the question individualistically, which we know thinking about methodological cosmopolitanism is a problem. So we basically have kind of put this false idea forward that in order to fix global climate change, that we have to get people to, what he says, undermine their lifestyles, their consumption habits, their social status, their life conditions, in what already are truly uncertain times, right? And so instead, what we need to do, and this is his call, is to introduce a kind of cosmopolitan solidarity to help us reframe this transnationally, right? So instead of thinking like, oh, you can't travel as much anymore, right? Because traveling, it causes too much pollution. Then you could say like, well, you know, like we're going to solve a problem together. And in order to solve this problem together, we're probably going to have to stay locally more, right? And instead kind of not make it about what we're taking away from people, right? But instead what we're giving them, right? And so what we're giving them is this ability to like be a global community and solve a problem as a global community. His second thesis, the environment, in this on page 825, column 1, if it includes everything which is not human, not social, that it is sociologically empty. But if it includes human actions in society, then it is scientifically mistaken and politically suicidal, right? And so, like, you know, we either take the people out of it, right? In which case, why should sociologists be there if it's not an issue, if it's not a social problem? But if it is about what people do, then it becomes what he calls, you know, kind of politically suicidal, because nobody wants to hear that they have to drive less or that they have to buy less or that they have to like live their lives differently or that they're living their lives wrong. And so, you know, this makes it seem very fatalistic. And he challenges us to recognize that our actions are not necessarily changing the environment, right? And you know, to kind of be able to see oh, sorry, that they are changing the environment, right? And that we have to kind of see things in terms of, thinking about our appetite for natural resources, and trying to think about like ways in which we can shift that to have more greening, right? A more, kind of to engage people to say like, hey, here's where you fit in, here's what you can do. It's almost like a Durkheimian turn, right? This idea that like we can build solidarity through it. So like, yeah, right now you're doing this thing in this way, but like if you do it this way, it's way more globally, it's way more global, it's way more cosmopolitan, that it's way more helpful to other people. And that then can make it so that we can engage people around what their actions are. So thesis 3, social inequality and climate change are not two sides of the same coin, on page 826. And so, he says, he makes a very famous claim that inequalities and climate both radicalize people. And so, we kind of had this idea, I think to some extent it still is prevalent, although certainly in the early 2000s it was highly prevalent, that ecological damage is just the price you pay for resource development, modernization, economic growth, right? And so if we want countries to develop, if we want to raise people out of poverty, then we have to do it through industrialization, in part because it's the only way we've known how so far is industrialization and colonialization, right? Is the only way we produce lots and lots of wealth. And so we have to be tolerable of that. We have to be tolerable of ecological damage in the spirit of it lifting people out of poverty. But that's not, so first of all, he says we can't do that. And we also can't do that in terms of just thinking about national levels of inequality, right? That we need to think about, like, on page 826, it is precisely this incorruptible realism open to the world which is designated by my concept of the cosmopolitan vision. It is not a matter of any official rhetoric or world fraternity, but of sharpening perceptions in everyday life, in politics and in scholarship, for the unbound explosive force of social inequality in the age of climate change. So effectively, like, we need to start seeing inequality as being a problem that can be worsened. That climate change is a problem that can be worsened by economic inequality. And so we have to really be prepared to, so instead of this idea of like, he says it's two sides of the same coin, we have to enrich people in order to help them position themselves to prepare for all of the damages that are going to come from environmental damage, right? And so, if you look at like, when we have like tsunamis happening in the Pacific, right, or whatever, like, these in these developing nations, it is just damaging beyond belief, right? Like certainly if you take the, like, I just mentioned the Pacific, if you take the case of Haiti and the Atlantic, right? I mean, like, like they have had such turmoil and like just basically like just kind of one step forward 10 steps back in terms of development based on all of the issues with natural damages, right, and these catastrophes, to use Beck's words, and like if people were economically better off, they would be more able to kind of have that, then not, that risk not also create additional problems, right? That perhaps you could, move, you could build better alert systems or build better, seawalls, like all these kinds of things that are available to you with more resources, that without resources, right, it's not going to happen. Thesis 4. Climate change, and this goes in line with number 3, climate change exacerbates existing inequalities between the poor and the rich, but it simultaneously dissolves them. The greater the planetary threat, the less the possibility that even the wealthiest and most powerful will avoid it. And so he uses, again, another really famous Beck quote, climate change is both hierarchical and democratic, right? And so, yes, as I was just saying, resources can greatly protect you in ways that if you have a natural disaster, you can bounce back. If you have a catastrophe, you can bounce back better than if you are in a very poor nation. But at the same time, there is amount of catastrophe that is just unbounce backable, right? And so, it gets a point that where these like weather events are going to be so big that like you can't throw enough resources at them, right? And so instead, like these places will become uninhabitable. And so that is like one of the discussions about, New Orleans post Katrina and moving forward, right? Is that like at some point, in if things keep going the way that they are, like that part of the United States will be uninhabitable. And so what do we do about that? Where do we go, right? And that's something that no amount of resources in the city or in the nation can protect us from. And it's particularly silly, according to Beck, because we all know it's coming. So we have to use this as an opportunity for kind of overcoming that, and overcoming, kind of thinking about this in terms of national interest, right? That we have to bound together with other nations, right? And eventually, like entire countries, entire areas, entire regions will be places where, due to climate, they're uninhabitable. And so that becomes not a national problem, but like a global problem, because what are we going to do with, all kinds of climate immigration, climate refugees, et cetera, et cetera. Thesis 5. Many of the problems are administrative. So accountability, compensation, and proof. So when we're talking about climate change, we need power structures, both within and between nations, that can form the legal, epistemological, and cultural power matrix in which risk politics is organized. So we need to decide who determines hazard and risk, who has responsibilities for them, the relationship between the risk producers and the harmed, what counts as proof of risk, in a world where knowledge and non-knowledge or risks are intrinsically fused and knowledge is contested and probabilistic. And he says it on page 827 in column 2. And so there is nothing that feels more right now to me than this, right? I mean, it's part of when I was, kind of putting the syllabus together this summer. It's like, my goodness, we have to read Beck right now, right? Because like nothing feels as real to me as having like such a failure in terms of who is determining the hazards and the risks, who has the responsibilities for them, right? Like, okay, so this restaurant, like Pierce County can say that you have to have a vaccine card to eat in the restaurant, but then the restaurant has to check. And then if they don't report it, then it goes to like the, I don't even know what happens, like State Department of Health, I don't even know, right? But all of these kinds of things are like so multi-layer with no clear line of responsibility, no clear line of power. And so in that, then you have like a complete failure of action, right? A complete failure of protection to people. So we have to agree on how to measure things. We have to agree on what cause and effect is, where it lives, right? So like we have to agree upon like, yes, this action that corporations do causes climate change, right? This action that people do causes climate change. And we need to coordinate this, right? And coordinate it both internally and between nations. Thesis 6. Media could and should present and visualize the problem that makes it visible to create shared involvement and suffering, to create shared relevance. And so, you need to make it like part of the knowledge base, right? Like part of cultural capital is kind of knowing climate on a global scale. We need to cooperate. We need to have coordinated resources, and we need to understand it and talk about it in the same way, right? And so, there's a huge debate now in the not now, it's long-standing in the United States, about like what the effect is of talking about climate change in Celsius, right? So like, yes, we are not on the metric system. Yes, the rest of the world is, but we are also huge emitters. And so what does that mean if we're talking about climate change in a metric that the average American does not understand, right, or cannot put to scale? And so, like if people don't understand, if Americans, let me be clear, do not understand what it means to increase by 2 degrees Celsius a year, then like Americans are never going to solve this problem. And so, like we have to then think about it. And in particular, we need to harness, he calls on Western news media. So in particular, he thinks that Western news media has the ability to do this thoughtfully, to be able to explain the risks to public in the way that they can understand. And to not make it, in his words, a song of the apocalypse, right? But a narrative to dream differently, he says on page 829. And so again, like it's not this like terrible thing. We're not all, like, oh, it's the worst, we're all gonna die. But like, hey, this is bad. And it's so bad that we need to act in this way to make it different, right? And if we make it different, these are the consequences of our actions that can be positively seen. Thesis 7, it's not about economic well-being, but it's about overall well-being, right? And so again, this idea of like, you know, this debate about what role does wealth have it and to play in it, right? In the development of wealth and the ability to kind of come, you know, to become a developed nation. That like, yeah, that's part of the argument, right? But then at the same time, like, what good is the money going to do for us when, like, you know, the seas have risen enough that we're all like living in a mountain on a mountain anyways, right? Like waiting for it to explode. So, you know, this idea that like global development it changes everything, right? That like, you know, like if we degrade the earth to an extent that we can't enjoy wealth, and then what's the point anyways? And so he says on page 829, if you see an opposition between modernity and nature, then you see the planet too fragile to support the hopes and dreams for a better world. And you underwrite an international caste system, right? And so, you know, again, Beck is positive in a way that I just can't be. So I wish that I could, you know, translate his words better for you in this capacity, right? But like, if we think that like this is it, like it's over, everything is terrible, right? Then what we're saying is, well, okay, the people on the bottom globally are always going to be there, right? Like, yes, there's devastating poverty. That's just the way it's got to be, right? And like, we have to do better. We have to do better for ourselves. We have to do better for the people experiencing that kind of poverty, right? So we just can't give up. And so the final thesis then, and I'm sorry that I've gone over a half hour, like swore I was going to get these done in 15 minutes. I have no idea how I thought I was going to do that. Cosmopolitanism is not only an urgent moral and political issue, but it is a power multiplier. So it is hard to do this, but if we unify and we all think that it is the right thing to do, the good thing to do, then we can do it in a way that is beneficial to others, and in a way that like really can amplify our power, right? Because again, from a Marxist perspective, right? I mean, Marx thinks we can overthrow capitalism because there are more workers than bourgeoisie. And there's even more people affected by climate than there are not, right? Because every single person is, right? So even if it was like the 99% versus the 1% in a Marxist argument, like Beck says, this is the 100% versus nobody, right? Like there should be absolutely nobody who is not on board with solving this problem, because it is what defines our generation. So he thinks we can do it, right? We just have to have a completely different mindset.